They said I was underperforming. At 8:12 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Marcus Hendricks, our chief operations officer, delivered those exact words while security flanked my desk like I was some kind of corporate criminal. "Samantha, your recent performance metrics don't align with our company standards. We're implementing immediate personnel restructuring. That was corporate speak for you're fired, and we're going to humiliate you in front of the entire floor to make sure everyone knows their place." What they didn't know was that in exactly 48 minutes, their biggest client would be calling for our 9 a.m. status update on the Meridian International contract. $680 million riding on systems, relationships, and protocols that existed nowhere but in my mind and my carefully guarded documentation. They thought they were disposing of dead weight. They were actually pulling the keystone out of their entire corporate empire. My name is Samantha Chen, and I've spent the last 8 years building the technical and operational backbone that allowed Cascade Global Solutions to punch above its weight in international project management. At 37, I'd climbed from junior analyst to senior project lead through pure competence, working 70-hour weeks and delivering impossible results while watching less qualified colleagues get promoted around me. This is the story of how corporate politics tried to erase me and how I let them destroy themselves in less than an hour. The morning started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at 6:45 a.m., 2 hours before most executives bothered to show up, to review the overnight communications from our Meridian International partners in Singapore and Frankfurt. The $680 million infrastructure development contract was our company's crown jewel, a 3-year deal that had elevated Cascade from a regional player to a serious international contender. For the past 18 months, I had been the primary technical liaison, the person who spoke the language of both our American executives and our demanding international clients. I should have seen the writing on the wall when they hired Bradley Morrison 3 months ago. Harvard MBA, consultant background, and most importantly, the son of board member Patricia Morrison. Bradley had been positioned as Director of Strategic Initiatives, a vague title that seemed designed to justify his $180,000 salary without requiring any actual responsibilities. He spent his first week creating PowerPoint presentations about optimizing operational efficiency and streamlining communication protocols. What that really meant was questioning everything I'd built, suggesting that my direct relationships with international partners were inefficient and that all communications should flow through proper channels, meaning him. Never mind that he couldn't pronounce half of our partners' names correctly, or that he'd never managed a project more complex than planning his fraternity's annual charity golf tournament. The signs of my impending doom had been accumulating for weeks. Email chains where I was suddenly moved to BCC instead of being a primary recipient. Meetings about my projects that I wasn't invited to attend. Requests for documentation that felt more like someone building a case than legitimate business needs. Most telling was last Friday's quarterly review, where Marcus had spent 20 minutes criticizing my communication style and team integration challenges. "Samantha," he'd said, reviewing papers that I was certain contained no actual performance data, "while your technical competency is acknowledged, we're seeing feedback about your collaborative approach. Some team members feel you're too controlling of project information, too insistent on doing things your way." I'd sat there listening to this character assassination, knowing that too controlling was code for she won't let us mess up her systems, and too insistent meant she actually knows what she's talking about and we don't. The real issue wasn't my performance, it was that I made certain people look incompetent by comparison. And incompetent people with connections don't like being shown up by competent people without them. But I'd survived 8 years of corporate politics by being thorough, by documenting everything, and most importantly, by making myself indispensable in ways that weren't immediately obvious to people who only understood org charts and quarterly reports. While Bradley was creating presentations about efficiency, I was the person who actually maintained the complex web of relationships, technical protocols, and institutional knowledge that kept our international projects running. The Meridian contract was particularly intricate. It involved coordinating between 7 different countries, managing 4 different regulatory frameworks, and maintaining real-time collaboration between teams that spoke 5 different languages. The technical infrastructure alone required constant monitoring, custom software integrations, encrypted communication channels, and compliance protocols that I'd spent months designing and implementing. More importantly, I had cultivated personal relationships with the key decision-makers at Meridian International. Chen Wei in Singapore, who trusted my technical assessments because I'd saved his previous project from a catastrophic delay. Dr. Martina Schmidt in Frankfurt, who appreciated that I understood both the engineering requirements and the regulatory constraints. James Macready in London, who had specifically requested that all technical communications go through me because he'd grown frustrated with other account managers who didn't understand the project's complexity. These weren't just business relationships, they were trust networks built over months of delivered promises, solved problems, and demonstrated competence. The kind of professional bonds that can't be transferred with an org chart update or a PowerPoint presentation about new reporting structures. So when Marcus walked up to my desk at 8:12 a.m. with security in tow, I wasn't entirely surprised. Disappointed, yes. Angry, absolutely, but surprised? I'd been expecting this play for weeks. What I don't think they expected was how calmly I would take it. I understand, I said, beginning to pack my personal items while the entire floor pretended not to stare. I'll need about 15 minutes to secure my files and transfer any urgent project responsibilities. That won't be necessary. Bradley Morrison appeared beside Marcus, practically vibrating with excitement. I've been brought up to speed on all your ongoing responsibilities. We'll handle the transition seamlessly. Brought up to speed, I almost laughed. Bradley had attended exactly 3 meetings about the Meridian project, spent most of them checking his phone, and had once asked me if Singapore was in China. But sure, he was ready to seamlessly handle relationships and technical protocols that had taken me 18 months to establish. What about the 9 a.m. check-in with Meridian? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Chen Wei is expecting a status update on the Phase 3 implementations, and Dr. Schmidt wants to review the revised compliance documentation. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. Bradley has been briefed on all client communications. We appreciate your concern, but this transition has been planned to minimize any disruption. Planned? Right, I could see their planning in Bradley's expression, the barely contained smugness of someone who thought he was finally getting his chance to prove himself. He had no idea that he was about to step into a machine with 10,000 moving parts, most of which he couldn't even see, let alone understand. I finished packing my personal items in silence. The framed photo of my parents at my graduation, the small jade plant that had survived 3 office relocations, the Stanford coffee mug that had carried me through countless late-night troubleshooting sessions. As I worked, I could feel my colleagues watching from their cubicles, some sympathetic, others calculating whether my departure meant advancement opportunities for them. Samantha, Marcus said as I closed my laptop bag, I want you to know this decision wasn't personal. It's simply a matter of organizational efficiency and aligning resources with strategic priorities. I nodded, shouldering my bag and taking one last look around the office where I'd spent the better part of a decade building something they thought they could simply hand over to someone else. I understand completely, Marcus. I hope the transition goes smoothly. As security escorted me toward the elevators, I passed Bradley settling into my desk chair, already pulling up my computer to access systems he'd never learned to use. I passed the conference room where next month's Meridian presentations were stored, presentations that assumed continuity of the technical infrastructure I'd built. I passed the project management board, where dozens of interconnected timelines and dependencies were mapped out in a complexity that looked simple only because I'd made it work seamlessly. The elevator doors closed at 8:27 a.m. and I found myself alone with Dave, the head of security, who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Sorry about this, Sam," he said quietly as we descended. "You know I think it's bull, right? Half the building thinks it's bull." "I know, Dave, it's not your fault. Want me to call you a cab?" "No thanks, I think I'll walk for a bit. Clear my head." I signed out at the front desk, surrendered my building access card and stepped out into the cool morning air. It was 8:31 a.m. In 29 minutes, someone was going to call the main conference room expecting to speak with me about critical project updates. Instead, they were going to get Bradley Morrison, who thought Phase 3 implementations was probably some kind of corporate buzzword. I walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop with good Wi-Fi and a quiet corner table, ordered a large cappuccino, and opened my personal laptop. I had work to do. The first thing I did was log into my personal cloud storage and review the documentation I'd been maintaining as insurance against exactly this scenario. For the past 2 years, I'd been meticulously backing up every critical process, every key contact, every technical specification that I'd developed. Not company proprietary information, I was too smart and too ethical for industrial espionage. But institutional knowledge, relationship maps, and process documentation that I'd created based on my own analysis and experience. Most importantly, I had a complete record of every commitment I'd made to Meridian International partners, every timeline I'd promised to maintain, and every technical standard I'd guaranteed to uphold. Commitments that were now Bradley Morrison's responsibility to fulfill, despite the fact that he couldn't even access half the systems required to do so. You see, in 18 months of managing the Meridian contract, I'd learned something important about international project management that they don't teach in business school. Trust is more fragile than reputation, and reputation is more fragile than profit margins. When you promise a client in Singapore that certain data will be delivered by a specific deadline using specific protocols, they don't care about your internal personnel changes. They care about whether you can deliver what you promised when you promised it. I opened my email and began crafting a simple message to my personal contact list, not company emails, but the professional relationships I'd built over 8 years of international project work. The message was brief and professional. Dear colleagues, please note that as of today, I am no longer with Cascade Global Solutions. If you have any ongoing project communications or concerns that you've been addressing through me, please direct them to the appropriate company representatives. Thank you for your collaboration over the years, and I look forward to potential future opportunities to work together. I sent that message to 43 contacts across 12 countries. Not a single word about corporate politics or unfair treatment, not a hint of bitterness or accusations, just a simple, professional notification that a key point of contact was no longer available. At 8:47 a.m., my personal phone buzzed with the first response. Chen Wei from Singapore. Samantha, what happened? We have major questions about Phase 3 that need immediate attention. At 8:51, Dr. Schmidt from Frankfurt. This is concerning. Who should we contact about the compliance documentation review? We have regulatory deadlines that cannot be delayed. At 8:54, James Macready from London. Please tell me this is temporary. We have implementation questions that require technical expertise. I responded to each message with the same professional courtesy. Please contact Cascade Global Solutions directly. I'm confident they will address your concerns promptly. At exactly 9 a.m., I checked my personal phone one more time, then put it on silent. I had a front row seat to watch what was about to unfold, but I wasn't going to participate in it. That would be unprofessional. 18 blocks away, in the conference room I'd helped design and equip for international calls, Bradley Morrison was probably sitting down for his first major client communication as my replacement. He would be confident, prepared with talking points that Marcus had given him, ready to demonstrate that Cascade Global Solutions remained as competent and reliable as ever. What he didn't know was that Chen Wei was calling with questions about a custom software integration that I'd spent 3 weeks debugging the previous month. Questions that couldn't be answered by reading project summaries or reviewing PowerPoint presentations. Questions that required understanding of specific technical decisions made in real-time collaboration with the Singapore team. What he didn't know was that Dr. Schmidt was calling about regulatory compliance documentation that existed in a format she and I had developed specifically to meet German engineering standards. Documentation that looked simple on the surface but contained dozens of interdependent requirements that had taken months to negotiate and implement. What he didn't know was that James Macready was calling with concerns about timeline coordination that involved balancing resource constraints across 4 different countries, managing dependencies that I'd mapped out through weeks of careful analysis and relationship building. At 9:17, my personal phone lit up with incoming messages. Chen Wei, we cannot reach appropriate technical personnel at Cascade. The representative seemed unfamiliar with our existing protocols. Dr. Schmidt, the person we spoke with, could not answer basic questions about our compliance requirements. This is unacceptable for a project of this scope. James Macready, Samantha, we need to discuss the status of this contract. The communication breakdown this morning raises serious concerns about Cascade's ongoing competency. I finished my cappuccino and ordered another one. It was going to be a long morning. By 9:35, the messages were coming faster and with increasing urgency. The Meridian partners weren't just confused, they were alarmed. In international project management, communication breakdowns are often the first sign of deeper systemic problems. When your primary technical contact suddenly disappears and their replacement can't answer basic questions about ongoing work, it suggests either incompetence or instability. Neither is acceptable when you're dealing with $680 million in commitments. At 9:42, I received a message that made me smile despite myself. Chen Wei again. Samantha, the Cascade representative, suggested we circle back offline to optimize our communication touchpoints. We need technical answers, not consulting jargon. Bradley was probably panicking by now, falling back on the MBA vocabulary that had served him well in academic case studies, but meant nothing to engineers who needed specific technical information. I could picture him in the conference room, frantically taking notes and promising to follow up with detailed responses, not realizing that his inability to provide immediate answers was being interpreted as evidence of systemic failure. The cascade effect was predictable once you understood the psychology of international business relationships. Meridian International hadn't chosen Cascade Global Solutions because we were the cheapest option or the most famous. They'd chosen us because I'd convinced them that we could deliver complex results on tight timelines with minimal drama. My track record of solved problems and met deadlines had been the foundation of their confidence in our company. Remove that foundation and the entire structure becomes questionable. At 9:58 my phone rang, not a text this time but an actual call, James Macready's number. I answered on the third ring. "Hello, James." "Samantha, thank God, we need to talk immediately. What the hell is happening at Cascade?" I could hear the frustration and concern in his voice. James was typically British in his reserved professionalism, so hearing actual emotion meant the situation was serious. "I'm no longer with the company as of this morning," I said carefully. "I'm sure they're working to address any communication issues." "Communication issues?" His voice rose slightly. "Samantha, we just spent 40 minutes on a call with someone who couldn't explain basic elements of our own project. When Dr. Schmidt asked about the Phase 3 compliance documentation, he said he'd leverage internal resources to circle back with comprehensive insights." She hung up on him. I winced. Dr. Schmidt was a brilliant engineer and a thorough professional, but she had zero patience for corporate nonsense. If she'd actually hung up on a client call, it meant Bradley had managed to offend her technical sensibilities in record time. "The documentation she's referring to," James continued, "it's critical for our regulatory approval timeline. Without it, we're looking at potential delays that could cascade through the entire project schedule. We have contractual obligations that depend on Cascade delivering specific results by specific dates." "I understand the urgency," I said, "but I'm really not the appropriate person to." "Samantha," his voice became quiet, serious. "Off the record, what should we be concerned about here? Is Cascade still capable of delivering what they've promised?" It was the question I'd been expecting and dreading. James wasn't just asking about morning communication problems. He was asking whether his company should continue trusting Cascade Global Solutions with $680 million worth of commitments. He was asking whether the competence they'd been paying for still existed. I chose my words carefully. "I think you should evaluate that based on their demonstrated ability to address your technical questions and meet your timeline requirements." There was a long pause, then, "Right. I think we need to schedule an emergency review with our executive team." After we hung up, I sat in the coffee shop watching the morning rush hour wind down, office workers settling into their routines, unaware that several time zones away, confidence in a major international contract was evaporating in real time. My phone continued buzzing with messages. Dr. Schmidt wanted to know if I was available for independent consulting. Chen Wei was asking for my assessment of Cascade's technical capabilities. 3 other Meridian partners were requesting direct communication outside of official channels. At 10:23, I received a text from an unexpected source, Jennifer Walsh, a project coordinator at Cascade who I'd mentored when she started 2 years ago. "Sam, I don't know what's happening, but Bradley just ran out of the conference room looking like he was going to throw up. Marcus is in emergency meetings, and people are saying the Meridian contract might be in trouble. What should I tell the team?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Tell them to document everything. Every decision, every communication, every timeline commitment. And maybe update their resumes." By 10:45, the situation had escalated beyond communication problems into a full-scale crisis of confidence. I knew this because Chen Wei sent me a message with a single line. "Meridian executive meeting called for tomorrow morning Singapore time to discuss Cascade contract status." In international project management, emergency executive meetings are the equivalent of relationship DEFCON 1. They happen when clients are seriously considering whether to terminate major contracts. They happen when trust has been so damaged that legal and financial teams need to assess options for cutting losses and finding alternative providers. At 11:12, my phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Hendricks. I answered with professional politeness. "Hello, Marcus." "Samantha," his voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath. "We need to talk. There seems to be some confusion with our international partners this morning." I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it gets resolved quickly. The thing is, they're asking for you specifically. Several of them seem to think that your departure creates problems for ongoing project delivery. I waited, saying nothing, let him ask for what he actually wanted. Look, I know this morning was abrupt, but perhaps we can discuss a consulting arrangement, temporary transition assistance to help smooth any communications issues. Consulting arrangement. The same man who'd had me escorted out by security 3 hours ago was now asking me to clean up the mess he'd created. The irony was delicious, but I kept my voice neutral. Marcus, I appreciate the offer, but I'm exploring other opportunities. I'm sure Bradley can handle the transition. He did say he'd been brought up to speed on all my responsibilities. There was a pause, then. Samantha, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. Meridian is suggesting they might need to reassess the entire contract framework. Reassess the contract framework. Corporate speak for they're talking about canceling everything. That sounds serious, I said. What kind of reassessment are they considering? Another pause, longer this time. They're questioning our technical capabilities and project management competency. Apparently, some communication issues this morning raised concerns about our ability to deliver on existing commitments. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Marcus was a decent enough middle manager who'd gotten caught between corporate politics and operational reality. He'd probably been pressured by the board to make changes that looked decisive and strategic, without understanding the practical consequences of removing institutional knowledge from complex international projects. But feeling sorry for him didn't change the fact that he'd chosen politics over competence, and now his company was facing the consequences. I'm sure you'll find a way to address their concerns, I said. Bradley seemed very confident about managing the transition. Samantha, please, can we meet, off the record, just to discuss the situation? I don't think that would be appropriate, Marcus. I'm no longer a Cascade employee, and it wouldn't be ethical for me to interfere with Bradley's responsibilities. After I hung up, I ordered a third cappuccino and opened my laptop to review the international project management job boards. 18 months of successfully managing a $680 million contract would look impressive on applications, especially after word spread about what happened when companies tried to replace that expertise with corporate politics. At 12:15, my phone buzzed with a text from Dave, the security guard. Sam, FYI, Bradley Morrison just got called into Marcus's office with HR. There's a lot of shouting. Thought you should know. At 12:33, Jennifer Walsh again. Emergency all-hands meeting called for 1:00 p.m. Rumors are flying about the Meridian contract. Some people are saying it might be canceled. At 12:47, Chen Wei sent me a LinkedIn connection request with a message. Samantha, Meridian is very interested in discussing independent consulting opportunities. Can we schedule a call? I was still reading that message when my phone rang. Unknown number, but the country code was familiar. Frankfurt. Hello, Samantha, this is Dr. Martina Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt never called anyone directly unless the situation was critical. She was a senior engineering director who normally communicated through formal channels and documented protocols. Hello, Dr. Schmidt, how can I help you? I am calling to inform you that Meridian International will be conducting an emergency review of our contract with Cascade Global Solutions. This morning's communication failure was unacceptable for a project of this technical complexity. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. However, I am also calling to ask if you would be available for independent consulting. Regardless of what happens with the Cascade contract, Meridian has regulatory deadlines that cannot be delayed. We need someone who understands our technical requirements and can deliver results without corporate interference. Independent consulting. It was an elegant solution, really. If Meridian terminated their contract with Cascade, they'd need alternative technical support to maintain their project timelines. If they kept the contract but demanded specific personnel requirements, they could insist that certain critical tasks be handled by proven specialists rather than inexperienced replacements. That's an interesting possibility, I said carefully. Obviously, I'd need to understand the scope and requirements before making any commitments. Of course, but Samantha, I want you to know that this morning's situation has created serious concerns about Cascade's ongoing competency. The person we spoke with could not answer basic questions about work that you and I spent weeks developing. It suggests either incompetence or institutional knowledge loss that makes them unreliable for critical project elements. After we ended the call, I sat in the coffee shop staring out at the afternoon foot traffic, processing the magnitude of what was unfolding. In less than 5 hours, Cascade Global Solutions had gone from confidently managing their biggest contract to facing potential cancellation and client demands for alternative service providers. It wasn't revenge, exactly. I hadn't sabotaged anything or deliberately undermined the company. I'd simply been honest about my situation and professional about maintaining relationships I'd built through years of competent service. The destruction was entirely self-inflicted, the predictable result of treating institutional knowledge as easily replaceable and relationships as transferable assets. At 1:23, my phone buzzed with a message that made everything clear. Emergency board meeting called for 2:00 p.m. to discuss Meridian contract crisis. Stock price down 12% in afternoon trading. Sources suggest major client cancellation possible. The message was from a business reporter at the local paper who'd been covering Cascade for years. By 2:00 p.m., I was no longer just an unemployed project manager. I was a potential solution to a corporate crisis that threatened to destroy everything Cascade had built over the past 3 years. My phone had been ringing nonstop for an hour. Marcus again offering increasingly desperate consulting arrangements. Bradley Morrison himself asking for transition assistance in a voice that suggested he'd finally understood the magnitude of what he'd inherited. 3 different Meridian partners, all interested in discussing independent service contracts. But the most interesting call came at 2:17 from Patricia Morrison, Bradley's mother and the board member whose influence had gotten him hired in the first place. "Miss Chen," she began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from controlling significant corporate decisions, "I believe we need to have a conversation about the current situation with Meridian International." "I'm listening," I said. "It's my understanding that some communication issues this morning have created concerns about our ongoing project delivery capabilities." Communication issues. Even now, they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge that they'd removed the person who made their biggest contract function smoothly. "I've heard there were some challenges," I said carefully. "Miss Chen, I'm going to be direct. The board is very concerned about the potential impact on our company's reputation and financial stability. Meridian International represents nearly 40% of our annual revenue." She paused, and I could hear the weight of corporate politics in her silence. Patricia Morrison had probably spent months maneuvering to get her son positioned for advancement, pushing for changes that would showcase his capabilities and justify his rapid promotion. Now that maneuvering was threatening to destroy the company he was supposed to help lead. "We're prepared to offer you a very generous consulting contract," she continued. "Immediate reinstatement of all benefits, a significant salary increase, and a formal apology for this morning's misunderstanding." Misunderstanding, as if having security escort me out for low performance was just a miscommunication. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm committed to maintaining my professional integrity. I can't simply reverse course after being terminated for supposed performance issues." "What if we could reframe the situation? Perhaps a story about restructuring that didn't work out as planned, followed by recognition that your expertise is essential for project continuity." I almost laughed. She was asking me to participate in saving face for the people who'd humiliated me 6 hours earlier, to pretend that my firing had been a strategic miscalculation rather than corporate politics run amok. "That's thoughtful," I said, "but I think my professional reputation would be better served by pursuing opportunities where my expertise is valued from the beginning, rather than after crisis management becomes necessary." There was a long pause. "Then, Miss Chen, what would it take for you to consider helping us resolve this situation?" It was the question I'd been waiting for, though I hadn't expected it to come from the board member whose nepotism had created the problem. "Mrs. Morrison, I think the most professional approach would be for Cascade to work with their existing personnel to address any client concerns. I'm confident that Bradley can handle the challenges with appropriate support." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She understood exactly what I was saying. I wasn't coming back to clean up their mess, and I wasn't going to make it easy for them to pretend this hadn't happened. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and began composing a more detailed response to Dr. Schmidt's consulting inquiry. If Cascade couldn't deliver the technical expertise that Meridian required, someone else would need to fill that gap. And if that someone happened to be the person they'd fired for low performance, well, that was just ironic justice. At 3:45, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Board meeting ended. Bradley Morrison resigned. Marcus announced immediate hiring freeze and strategic review of operational priorities. People are scared. At 4:12, Chen Wei sent me a formal consulting proposal with terms that were double my previous salary and a timeline that would begin immediately. At 4:33, James Macready forwarded me an official Meridian statement. Following this morning's communication issues with Cascade Global Solutions, Meridian International is conducting an emergency assessment of our service provider relationships. We are evaluating alternative options for critical project elements to ensure continuity of our regulatory and technical requirements. By 5:00 p.m., the business news had picked up the story. Cascade Global Solutions faces potential contract cancellation after staff changes disrupt major client relationships. The article quoted unnamed sources suggesting that personnel decisions had created technical knowledge gaps that threatened the company's largest contract. I closed my laptop and walked out of the coffee shop into the evening air. 12 hours ago, I'd been Samantha Chen, underperforming employee. Now I was Samantha Chen, independent consultant with multiple international clients interested in my services, and a former employer discovering the hard way what happens when you confuse politics with competence. My phone rang one more time as I walked to my car. Marcus again. Samantha, please, the board is prepared to make this right. Name your terms. I stopped walking and looked back toward the downtown skyline, where the lights were coming on in office buildings full of people working late to solve problems that competent management could have prevented. Marcus, I said quietly, 8 hours ago you told me I was underperforming and had me escorted out by security. Now you're asking me to name my terms. What changed? There was a long silence. Then, we made a mistake. Yes, you did, but the mistake wasn't firing me, Marcus. The mistake was thinking that competence is replaceable, that relationships are transferable, and that politics can substitute for expertise. You didn't just fire me, you fired the institutional knowledge that made your biggest contract work. So what do we do now? I got into my car and started the engine. Now you learn to live with the consequences of your decisions, and I move on to work with people who understand the value of what I bring to the table. I hung up and drove home, where I spent the evening reviewing consulting proposals from 3 different international firms, all offering compensation packages that reflected the market value of genuine expertise rather than corporate politics. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Cascade Global Solutions and a news alert that their stock price had